Alright, so this is going to be a really brief tutorial just about how to reset up glass in Arnold. So I've just assigned this a new Arnold standard surface shader. I have an HDRI in the background, you just can't see it, it's like behind these walls that I've added in. And then I've gone down to transmission, just set the weight all the way to 1. That's going to make it clear like this. And you'll forgive me for having such tiny renders, but like honestly my computer is like really not having the rendering right now. And then for color, just to get this sort of gradient effect, I've just added like this really subtle ramp here. I could throw in maybe I'll throw in like green, because I like green. And then I found that unless you want it to be like crazy intense, like you just make this like as pastel Easter color as you possibly can. And then it's gonna have like not as aggressive of an effect on the object. So anywho, so again, this is for Arnold. You can see here my green. So I'll just throw that in there. And you'll notice once this is done rendering, if you noticed it before, the shadow is like completely dark and it looks a little ridiculous. To fix that, you just want to select your object, go under the shape node of it in your attribute editor, and under the Arnold tab, just uncheck opaque. And then that should at least make it a transparent shadow. You'll notice it also fixed a lot of the gross sort of rendering issues where the base was, really, really dark. And you can see like it's like, you know, looks like thing. Now I have clear shadow because I have color on this. The color is also shining through. And at this point, so if you wanted to add caustics to this, which doesn't really seem like caustics is good. It's super weird. So like, caustics is supposed to be awesome. It looks awesome on everyone else's renders. For some reason, in Arnold, when I turn on caustics, it does basically nothing. I've tried different scales, I've tried different objects. Anyway, so if you go into material, under the advanced tab, you just turn on caustics, exit the background, and internal reflections. It's gonna bump your render time up a little bit. And by a little bit, I mean possibly a little significantly. But ideally what this should do is give you some of those like interesting sort of shadows and lights. Like if you ever look at a glass of water with a light shining through it, you'll see all those sort of like really bright highlighty ripple bits. And again, ideally that's what caustics should do. So I've saved a snapshot. So here's without caustics, with caustics. You can see, so caustics makes like this area in here look a million times nicer. It has more, and again, you'll pardon the fact that this is like a 100 pixel render, but so it makes like this area in here look a lot nicer. There's a lot of like little shadows in here, some reflections that show up in the hair, excuse me, compared to this without caustics. And it also adds, you can see, so caustics in here, if you look right in this area, it's also added like a few little highlights in there, just a little bit brighter, but mostly the caustics does a really nice job of making this glass look more sort of glassy and have a little bit more depth in it. So there's a few settings that you can use to sort of, I guess, tweak. If you ever turn on caustics and it like doesn't quite look right, under the Arnold render settings, you could look at stuff like, where is it? Like volume transparency, volume direct. A lot of these sort of, like these sliders here, these guys, will sort of fiddle a little bit with the, what am I saying? Will fiddle a little bit with the, I guess, attributes of how this behaves to a certain extent. If I set transparency depth to 0 and re-render, it's probably going to be real funky looking. Like it might actually, it's been a while since I played with that, but it might actually just like get rid of the shadow to an extent. Yeah. So I mean basically, so like transparency depth is basically how deep will the rays go, how many times will the rays go through your object. So again, you'll notice so like here's caustics, still caustics, but just with transparency depth set to 0. if I set on this, see what happens if I set this to 45. Hopefully it doesn't explode my render. The default is 10. But anyway, so ray depth is basically like it'll shoot, Maya will shoot what's called a ray from the light down through your object, and the ray depth is basically how deep it goes. So like for transparency, the more transparent you make it, or like the higher you set this, theoretically, the farther it will penetrate through your object before hitting the ground, if that makes sense. So you'll notice, so like here's transparency enough to 45 versus 10. And here you have this like a little bit of a dark area here. So what probably happened, so Maya shoots the light out, and it gets through the object, gets through most of the head, and then it's like, can't go any farther, cool, I'm done. And it kind of stops the arm, and that's why you get that hard shadow there. So if you set this to 45, you get a lot softer shadow, like going through the arm. Not saying it's ideal, just like, you know, play with it until your object is as transparent as you need it to be. It doesn't seem to be drastically affecting render times of this, but it's also a super tiny image, so like the higher you set this, theoretically, it's going to bump up your render times because it's doing more calculations, depending on how deep your objects are. But yeah, so I mean that's pretty much Caustics in Arnold. And you'll notice again, fiddling with transparency depth in particular doesn't really mess with the Caustics or like these little light reflections in the object itself. The rest of this is literally just going to be me fiddling around with settings in here. If you're interested in looking, you're welcome to, yeah. Because I like playing with render settings. Volume, I think, would be, unless I'm mistaken, but I do believe volume would be like if you had fog or sort of environmental effects going on. This is insane. This is literally, like I said, 100 pixel image. Yeah, so that doesn't seem to have really done anything. Yeah, so that would be like if I had fog in my scene, so I'm just going to set this back down to 2. Transmission. Yeah. Let's see what happens if I set this to 50, like a crazy person. Ha 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 ha. If that didn't mess up my render time before, I hate to see what this is going to do. Makes it faster, I will get a little bit salty. Honestly, it doesn't seem to be slowing it down dramatically. Super gross image quality. Snapshot. Okay, so that's why I was getting like that horrible, awful, disgusting black highlight in here. So messing with transmission, again, that's the weight, basically weight or clearness or like glassiness of your object. So setting that up higher, you'll notice again here it's like, there's like this awful, disgusting black area, and that's probably because the rays are like shooting through the object, reaching whatever, I think I had to set to like 8 before. It's going like 8 units deep, and it's like, cool, I'm done, and then it makes this disgusting black area. If I set that higher, again, it'll just sort of go further through your object. If you have really deep objects, this will probably affect your render times. But, oh, here you go. So 30 second, 29. I actually made it slightly shorter. Awkward. But anywho, so that's mostly those. Again, if you're ever using transparent objects and you're having issues with stuff looking black or not looking clear, just hit up your ray depth tab in here. And then you should be able, under here, if you're having issues with like transmission sampling, you'd want to like fiddle with that. SSS is subsurface scattering, that's for like skin. And then volume indirect, I've never really played with it, but I would assume that's also for like environmental stuff like fog. But yeah, so hopefully that's helpful.